Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Sella, and in this talk we're going to discuss how to maximize the impact of your donations. But first I want to thank you for that support. First I want to give some context. So many of us live in communities of people of similar wealth to ourselves. And so it's very easy to forget how incredibly lucky we are and how incredibly impactful our donations can be. Because of the very extreme distribution of global income in the world, we have the opportunity to create huge change with our donations. Just to get some context, so for example, a person making about 10,000 shekels a month is already on the 98th percentile of income globally. And this seems very unintuitive to us because we don't interact with the vast majority of these people. And I don't even want to try and mark the average Googler on this graph. But what that means is that by donating amounts that we literally would not even notice if they were missing from our banks, we can create meaningful change in the lives of many people. For example, out of the hundreds of millions of people who currently live on less than $2 a day. But it doesn't only matter that we donate, it also matters how we donate. And I want to start with one simple example. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Play Pumps, the NGO. Okay, so Play Pumps is an NGO, a nonprofit, that builds merry-go-rounds, or in Hebrew, karuselot, which are also water pumps. So what they do is they build this machinery that provides children with a fun and social activity, and at the same time also reduces hours of hard work and labor for the women of the village who kind of customarily would spend their days pumping a lot of this water for their families. And then they distribute these pumps across regions without good access to water. So I want to start with a short vote, at least those of you that are physically here. I want you to think of whether you think this NGO is a good NGO, a good idea, or a bad idea. Okay, there's no middle ground in this question. So let's raise your hand if you think this is a good idea. Okay, raise your hand if you think this is a bad idea. Okay, so we have a strong majority towards a good idea, and you're not alone. This NGO has received tens of millions of dollars in donations from significant organizations. But sadly, after it had been running already for several years and received quite a lot of donations, someone kind of worked around to actually doing an impact evaluation, trying to visit those villages where these pumps have been installed, and they found some interesting results. What they found is that in almost all the villages where these pumps are installed, children don't actually play with these pumps. And the reason is, merry-go-round is fun when you can do like this and then start swinging around, but if you have to constantly continue pushing because you're actually pumping water, it ends up being not that fun. And then because the children don't play, then someone needs to be able to pump the water, so those same women have to then pump the water through these merry-go-rounds, which are substantially less energy efficient, so they have to spend more hours than they would if they were to pump with regular optimized water pumps. Possibly even worse, women have reported that they find this humiliating to have to run around a children's toy for hours a day. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, because these play pumps are specialized proprietary hardware, then you can't just easily and cheaply buy replacements when parts of them break down, as they do. And as a result, many villages are left without effective water pumping systems for months and sometimes years. And the reason I bring this example is not to say, haha, look at you, you thought this was a good idea. The reason is that it's just much, much easier to build an exciting narrative, and an exciting story, and an exciting potential path to doing genuinely important work than it is to actually make that work on the ground. And it's not enough to hear an exciting story. What you need is evidence. What you need is to check whether that story checks out and whether it creates real impact. An even more extreme example is what's actually America's most famous crime intervention, raise your hand if you've ever heard of Scared Straight. Okay, so a minority, at least here in Tel Aviv. Scared Straight is, in the United States, actually a pretty famous intervention. It started in the 70s, I think, where they would take middle schoolers and high schoolers into prisons. And in those prisons, criminals who volunteer would give them talks where they'd be very scary and say, oh, if you'll find yourself here, we'll bleep you up, and all of this they're very, very serious and very scary. And then the kids are like, oh, jail is so terrible that they stay out of trouble. That's the idea of this intervention, and it's incredibly famous and incredibly well-funded. But despite making a great story and a great set of movies and TV shows, which there are in the United States, there are dozens of what's called randomized control trials, what's kind of the golden standard of evidence in trying to assess these types of interventions, showing that not only does Scared Straight not work, participating in the Scared Straight program makes children 1.7 times more likely to commit crimes in the future. And the really depressing part about these examples is not that they exist, because we experiment and we try different things, and some things work and some things don't. What really is depressing is that both of these programs to this day continue to be funded significantly and heavily. And the reason for that is that most donors don't bother to look at the research that's available. They don't bother to check whether the money that they're spending out, money that they spend because they genuinely care, whether that actually ends up implementing the things that they're hoping for. And I think a part of the reason that people don't spend that time is there's been multiple surveys where people were asked, how different do you think is the effectiveness of the most effective charities versus an average charity? Right? You guys can think what you think the answer to that is. Right? Is the most effective charity 10% more effective, 2 times more effective, 10 times more effective? When people are asked in surveys, they often give answers of about, on average, 20%, so that the best charities are 20% better than the average charity. And if that were indeed the case, then maybe it would make sense not to look at the evidence, right? Because you'd say, well, why work hard for that extra 20%? What's important is that I'm donating, right? That I'm doing something. But reality tells a very, very different story. The effectiveness of charities and the interventions that they use varies wildly, with the best interventions usually being more than 100 times more effective per dollar than the average intervention within the same field. What you're looking at right now is the distribution of effectiveness of different charities in the disease reduction field. So specifically things that try to reduce the burden of disease of malaria and AIDS and other types of diseases. To give a few more details, so what we're really looking at here is what's called the dollars per $1,000. DALY is short for Disability Adjusted Life Years. It's a way in public health to measure the amount you helped someone. People don't like using the measures of lives saved because in some technical sense, a life is never saved. Everyone will still die sometime, but we do help them significantly by increasing their lifespan and maybe even improving their health throughout that time. So DALYs is kind of like saying one DALY is one additional year of healthy life that you provide someone. So what we're seeing is the distribution of various different interventions and how many years of healthy life they provide for every $1,000 invested. And what you can see here is that you have a lot of charities that provide a few dollars per $1,000, but there are a small number that can literally provide hundreds of years of healthy life. What this means concretely is that, let's say, for example, you decide you really care about the burden of disease, you want to help people and prevent preventable diseases from afflicting them. And let's say here on this giving week, you decide you want to donate $1,000, which is an admirable donation. And let's say you don't know much about the different charities, So you arbitrarily pick one of the health-related charities that you want to choose. On average, this will help someone gain more than a month of healthy life, which is really an enormous and significant gift to give someone. I know that for myself, the last $1,000 that I spend on myself is usually on things that are much less important to me, not to mention anyone else, than another month of my life. But by additionally switching that donation to the most effective charities without spending a single additional dollar, I can provide up to 10 years of additional health to various people. So there really is a lot to be gained here from looking at the research. In fact, just a few weeks ago, Estelle Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee, and Michael Kremer, who pioneered the research that makes the evidence that I'm talking about now possible, won the Nobel Economics Prize. So they've kind of revolutionized the field of development economics, and it's a lot of those methodologies that allow us to make much more informed decisions about what kind of change we want to create in the world. But the challenge is that there are thousands of charities that are all vying for your attention, and understanding the effectiveness of each one requires a literature review of randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses, not to mention understanding the economics and the statistics required to really, truly evaluate all of that data. And that's hard, and we all have jobs to do, and not all of us have the time to go through all of this information. But luckily, there exist organizations that do all of this hard work for us and present the results in an easy-to-understand way, so that we can just act on the results without starting all the research from scratch ourselves. GiveWell is probably the most famous of these organizations. It was founded in 2006 by a couple of hedge fund analysts that wanted to donate their own money, and were quite shocked to find out that, as opposed to financial markets, where they have a wealth of information to use whenever they're trying to make decisions, in the field of donations, they couldn't find any evidence-backed information about what the different options that they have to offer. And so they started this effort originally to help direct their own donations, but they eventually identified that there might be a lot of people interested in this information, and started providing that information to everyone else as well. GiveWell uses three main metrics to evaluate the charities that they recommend. The first is cost effectiveness. For every additional dollar that we pay in, what is the actual effects that we get? How many more dollies, years of healthy life, are provided to someone? How many more children get a better education? How much are each of these individuals affected? Right? What do we get? What do they get? What changes happen to their lives? And trying to quantify these estimates as best as they can. The second metric is what's called the evidence of effectiveness. Let's say I think that for every dollar that I pay, or let's say every $100 that I pay, I give someone another year of healthy life. How confident am I in these estimates? Am I certain? Are there lots of experiments showing the exact same number, and I'm fairly confident that this is exactly what I'm getting? Or are there a lot of assumptions built in? Am I actually not that confident that because this worked in Zimbabwe, it'll also work in Kenya, right? So the evidence of effectiveness tells us not just what we currently estimate is the cost effectiveness, but is there really a strong body of research showing that this is indeed the case? Or is this still fairly speculative and uncertain? And finally, they look at room for more funding. Often, when you implement an intervention, you first go to the locations and use the tools that are the most effective or the cheapest, at least if you're doing a good job. For example, if what you're trying to do is reduce the instances of malaria, you'll go first to the most malaria-affected regions and try to provide your solution there. As you grow and get more funding, you start filling out those places that are the most cost-effective and those tools that you have. And usually, not always, but usually, your cost-effectiveness slowly declines. As a result, what GiveWell tried to estimate is how much more funding would an organization need before they become significantly less cost-effective than they are today. Maybe with the first $3 million that we give them, they continue being cost-effective in a similar manner to the way they are today, but after that, they will have to move on to less effective interventions. So we talked a lot about the methodology. Let's talk a bit about what are the conclusions. What are some organizations that are recommended by GiveWell as the most cost-effective charities in the world? The ones where each dollar goes the farthest to help people improve their lives. The first is an organization called Against Malaria Foundation. What they do is distribute anti-malaria bed nets and teach people how to use them. On average, they give a child a full year of healthy life for every $100 of donation that they get. This is a mind-blowing number. $100 gives a full year of healthy life on average. Give Directly simply gives cash transfers to extremely poor individuals and households in rural areas, allowing them to invest in themselves and their children. On average, every $100 that you donate create a significant difference in the economic well-being of about 5 families. What does significant difference mean? That will require some more details I'm not going to go into now, but you can go on GiveWell's site and see a lot more details than I'm going into right now. SCI provide deworming medication, reducing the disease burden of children and allowing many of them to improve their performance at school and therefore in their later careers. On average, every $100 that you donate provide about 10 children with an improved career path throughout their lives. Again, incredible change for very small amounts of money. Now, these 3 different examples highlight a very important point. Different charities do very different things. So one might ask, how can you compare between them, right? In what sense can I say, let's say, whether Against Malaria Foundation is better than Give Directly? Or even, based on what do GiveWell have the chutzpah to say that these charities are better than many other charities that might be doing completely different things? I think it's important to understand that prioritizing between charities requires a combination of 2 things. First is a lot of value judgments. There's a lot of hard moral and personal questions on what you think is more important. I gave a few examples of cost effectiveness here, right? One involved, for example, reducing fatalities in children, as Anti-Malaria Foundation is very good at doing. The other had to do with lifting people out of poverty. There is a value judgment here on what you care about and what change you want to see in the world. And that is a decision for you to make. But it also requires a lot of empirical evidence. Let's say you've decided that what you want to do is save lives. You still have the empirical question of which of the thousands of organizations that try to achieve this goal are the most effective at what they do. To be able to provide this service to everyone, regardless of what their values are, GiveWell uses transparency to make it easy to use the research that they've created or that they've done or that they utilize based on your preferences. What they do is not only publish their recommendations and who they actually believe are the most cost-effective charities, they also publish all of their calculations, each and every decision that they've made along the way, and including all of their value judgments. To make this even easier to use, they aggregate all of their value judgments, or as they call them, moral weights, into a single simple sheet. What you can do is you can go on GiveWell's website and just change all of the numbers on all the subjective decisions that they've made. How important is reducing a fatality of a child under 5 relative to helping a family escape from poverty? And again, these things are better defined on their website than I'm kind of fully going into here. You can then update these with your opinions about what you care about, and automatically, all of their calculations are updated with the same rigor of evidence, but optimized for the values that you care about. Now, it's important to clarify, you don't have to dive into moral weights and data sheets and all the evidence behind these situations. You can definitely just look at the recommendations, arbitrarily choose between the top recommended charities in the world, and all of these charities do incredible work. You really don't have to work hard. But if you're the type of person who cares deeply about whether my dollar is going towards this goal or the other one, or if you're deeply offended by the idea that someone will tell you what are the values that you should believe in, then you're definitely welcome to go on GiveWell's website and change those values decisions to meet your goals. Now, I know that many people prefer to give locally, right? In Israel, we call it Aniyei Ircha Kodmin. And you may have noticed that none of the top charities that I've mentioned so far happen to be in Israel. So rather than asking what are the most effective charities in the world, many people ask themselves, what are the most effective charities in Israel? I have two pieces of bad news about this and one piece of good news about this. First, sadly, Israel is kind of behind on measurement and impact evaluation. There is currently no genuinely reliable, properly controlled studies into the cost effectiveness of charities in Israel. As a result, everything I will say about charities that are based in Israel is much less reliable than the rest of this talk. As a side note, I'll mention that an organization called Effective Altruism Israel is currently working to try and change that so that in future years we'll have more information. Second, from what we do know, local charities in Israel and in the rest of the developed world are vastly less effective than charities in developing countries. Just as a simple example, the charity called Nurse Family Partnerships, one of the most cost-effective NGOs in the developed world, provides information to families with young children on what medical decisions they should make and so on. And their costs per family that they support is about $10,000 per family. And this in return to providing less life-saving services than, for example, AMF provide per family that they serve. What this means is that the options that we have in developed countries are vastly less cost-effective. There are systematic reasons why this is the case, and they apply to Israel as well. One systematic reason is because we have functioning education and health services. For example, in Israel, if you have life-saving interventions, or even an intervention that increases your expectancy of life by at least 1 year and costs less than tens of thousands of shekels, as broadly speaking, they will be included in what's called Sella Nevo, or the free health services in Israel. This is great news. This means we are lucky enough to live in a country where if there is a solution that can help many people and is relatively cost efficient, we get it for free already. We don't even need to think about that and look for places to donate. Of course, things always fall between the cracks, right? No country is perfect, and Israel is definitely no exception to that. But Israel also does pretty well in terms of filling out those holes through nonprofit activities. In 2018, NGOs in Israel received more than 160 billion shekels. That's almost 20,000 shekels per individual living in Israel. What this means is, again, not everything gets done, but we actually have good institutions to try and find cost-effective solutions, and those successful charities actually have good sources of funding. So I originally wrote this as bad news, but I do really want to point out, this is really, really good news, right? We live in a country where, regardless of how much we personally pay out of our pockets with donations, the most cost-effective interventions tend to already be funded. But many people even with this information, still prefer to donate in Israel, whether for personal reasons or for tax deductibility reasons. Many people still ask the question of what are the most cost-effective charities in Israel. And the last good news that we have is that we do have good sources of answering this, given the constraints that I just mentioned, which is A, that they won't be as cost-effective as charities in developing countries, and B, that our certainty about the responses that I'm going to show in a moment is much, much lower than our certainty about things that I've mentioned until now. A reasonably good way to identify good charities is listening to an organization called Midot, which aims to estimate the effectiveness of charities in Israel and provide recommendations on how charities can become more effective. Here are 3 examples of charities that received the Effectiveness Award by Midot. They give out 1 or 2 of these every year for the past 6 years. And I think, again, our confidence about these recommendations is not as high as other recommendations I'll give in this talk, but choosing one of these recommendations is definitely better than taking an average charity on Israel. These are charities that at least we do know are properly function. We know that the money is broadly going to where they say they're going, and we know that they organize their work in a way that's broadly effective. But all the charities we discussed so far try to help people, and people are not necessarily the only ones we care about. Animal charity evaluators try to identify the most effective animal welfare charities in the world. Animals are often given much less care and concern in the world than people are. And as a result, there actually remain immensely cost-effective opportunities that still need funding. Animal Equality and the Humane League both support what's called corporate outreach campaigns, among other things that they support. Corporate outreach campaigns use consumer boycotts or threats of consumer boycott to convince enormous companies to make changes that are very important to animal welfare, but are not that costly for the company itself. For example, one of these interventions is increasing the size of cages that laying hens stay in. You can actually, without a huge cost, increase the size of the cage from one in which the hen really can't move much and thus lives a life of pretty painful suffering, to a place where it can lead a somewhat normative life. At least in the physical sense, it doesn't have to endure significant pain throughout most of its life. And these corporate outreach campaigns are incredibly effective, if you care at least about the welfare of animals. For every about $100 donation, you can prevent about 100 chickens from a life of such significant suffering. So improve it, for example, from the smaller cage to the larger cage. And Animal Equality and the Humane League have both been identified as incredibly effective charities implementing this intervention. Now, until now, we've almost only spoken about incredibly well-researched interventions. And that's good, because evidence is really important. But what if the most cost-effective interventions are ones that are revolutionary and by definition can't be measured well in advance? Well, our first such example of a recommended charity of that type is what's called the Good Food Institute. The Good Food Institute supports the development of alternatives to animal-based food. For example, the clean meat burgers that I assume many of you know, and I hope many of you have eaten here at the Google office, are one such example of an alternative to animal-based meat. But GFI has not only works on an important problem, but has also been identified as one of the most cost-effective charities in the world to try and bring about the revolution in the food industry. So no one can tell you what is the cost-effectiveness of this organization. We don't know how much money it will take to create this food. But it's been identified as working on an incredibly important research problem and being very effective in creating change in that research field. Tomorrow, we're actually going to have a talk from the Israeli office of the Good Food Institute And in fact, the Good Food Institute is the only globally recognized, only charity that's globally recognized as one of the most effective charities in the world that also has an office in Israel. So I strongly recommend both going to the talk as well as donating to them. The last point I made about whether waiting for evidence is worth it is an important one. One could reasonably argue that inherently, the most effective things you could donate to will always have a lack of evidence behind them. They will always be things that are revolutionary and are new, for example, like scientific research or advocacy. For this purpose, GiveWell, the same GiveWell we mentioned earlier, founded a spin-off called the Open Philanthropy Project, whose goal is to look into these kinds of donations. They don't look for the donations where we're confident are great places to donate to. Instead, they take a hits-based philanthropy approach. It's kind of similar to venture capitalism, but for the donation world. Instead of going for places where we know they'll do a lot of good, they try to invest in a lot of different organizations, most of which will probably fail. But the hope is that what they're trying to achieve is so important and so effective that even a few successes out of the different donations will more than make up for all of the failures. The following are 4 areas that they've identified as extremely promising for donations because they're important and there are concrete opportunities for making significant breakthroughs. These include 1, criminal justice reform. Prison policy and justice policy, especially in the United States, leads to incredible amounts of suffering. And there's a lot of research showing that minor policy changes can significantly not only improve the welfare of people who are in that system, but actually also reduce crime. Second is scientific research, whether that's the example we just saw about clean meat, as well as other tools that can help us find energy solutions to many of our problems, as well as others, medical research, and so on. Thirdly, we have existential risk, problems that are a threat to the entire world, nuclear war, biological war, technological risks, and tend to be incredibly underinvested in, mainly because our governments and democracies tend to adapt well to things they have experience with, but you don't see as many protests about things that haven't happened and might happen in 100 years. Climate change is a very encouraging, in some senses, counterexample to this. People are finally caring more about what will happen to our children and grandchildren. And finally, macroeconomic stabilization, things that will, in general, improve economic both stability and growth, and will hopefully help support things like scientific research and so on, and other ways of improving the world. It's important to note, like I said in the beginning, in none of these areas, and I'll show in a moment a few examples of concrete charities, but in none of these areas we have any proof or can make any promises about what their effectiveness will end up being. But these are areas where there really is an opportunity for creating incredible change, and therefore might justify donating to. So I want to give a few bottom lines before we move on to questions. First, where you donate really matters. It's true, it's incredible when you decide to donate, and it's incredibly important, but you can have an even bigger difference by deciding to donate to the right place, and it's worth the effort to do so. Secondly, expressing your values can work side by side with listening to the evidence. You don't have to choose between deciding what you care about and listening to the evidence that already exists. You can optimize the evidence based on your values. And finally, no hard work is needed to do any of this. You can always fall back on experts if you don't have the time or the willingness to do this. Just take one of the recommendations of these organizations, even if you don't want to optimize for your own values. You just want to say, look, within 30 seconds, I want to be able to donate to something. That's fine. As opposed to choosing randomly among all organizations, choosing randomly among evidence-backed recommended organizations is a pretty good choice. And last thing before questions, I wanna give a few action items of what you can do this week. First, I recommend checking out more recommended charities on givewell.org, animalcharityevaluators.org, and openphilanthropy.org. The examples that I gave are not all of the recommended charities. There are other charities that do other incredibly important things. I just want to keep this kind of short and light. Second, be generous and effective on Giving Week. You have a great opportunity of easily donating and getting your donations matched, which increases your impact. It's worth noting that almost all recommended charities by these organizations are recognized and matched by Google. So you can you still have a wide range of choice. And of these organizations, Give Directly is also allowed for TRIPS credits donations, which means you can donate to them without literally paying a single dollar of your own money. So I strongly recommend that. The TRIPS credits donations have been opened today, and they tend to run out quickly. So I would recommend donating soon. Lastly, if you're interested in learning more on how to help others effectively, whether that's through your donations or through your career or volunteering, I recommend checking out www.effectivealtruism.org.il. There's tons of other resources if you're more interested in this area. So if you have any questions, this would be a great time to ask them. Yeah.
Do you have a mic or? So I have a question regarding smaller organizations. So those big companies are analyzing big donation, and you mentioned before that the biggest is the organization, the hardest it is for it to be efficient.
Yeah.
So what about these missed opportunities of mapping those small ones that are incredibly efficient?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So I think there are two. So first of all, indeed, smaller organizations, or in many ways, could be a potentially promising opportunity because you have a chance of making a bigger difference on the trajectory of that organization. And it is indeed harder to evaluate their effectiveness. There are, even within the organizations that I mentioned, recommendations for smaller organizations. So first of all, it's worth mentioning that the Open Philanthropy Project, which focuses more on these kind of high-risk donations, does include smaller organizations that are only in the beginning of their path. So those do exist. GiveWell also recognized this point, and has started providing their own grants for organizations that are potentially promising, but have not grown enough to be able to prove their value. And if you want to donate, you can also look at their grants as well as organizations they looked into and didn't provide a grant to. So there's also resources on how to identify those organizations. But indeed, that is a bigger challenge. That's true.
What about things that are hard to quantify? So long-term education, peace, things that might influence millions, but no one will go into the task of trying to compute ROI for each one.
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question just for anyone who's not here physically in the room. The question was, what about things that are harder to quantify? Long-term effects, peace, education, and things like that. So I think that goal is exactly why the Open Philanthropy Project was created, and that's what the Open Philanthropy Project tries to do. Its focus is primarily on these kinds of changes that will have an effect for many years that have to do with research. There's also a lot of things that have to do with international stability relating to kind of your point about war. So there are definitely recommendations for those areas as well.
Maybe also say that within education you can find.
Yeah, that's a good point. So within the field of education, there are incredibly large differences between different charities. I think an important point to make on this is that not only is there a huge difference between different charities, but whether a charity measures its effectiveness has a large impact on how effective it ends up being when someone comes and measures it. I think we're very used to this idea in the for-profit domain, where obviously if you're a startup or even a big company like Google and you want to optimize for, let's say, click-through rate, obviously if you're not gonna you're not going to measure your click-through rate and see what improves it or doesn't improve it, you're not going to get very far. And the same applies to these organizations. So even within things like education, it's more difficult to do research on education. The effects are longer term, and therefore these experiments tend to be more costly and take more time. But there are organizations that have to do with education that are evidence-backed. And just to mention, many of the organizations that have to do with health have actually been shown to improve education outcomes even more than most direct education interventions. For example, I mentioned the SCI, which does the deworming interventions, which is supposedly a health-based interventions, removing intestinal worms. The main impact that they have is that they allow children to attend school more often because they're less sick, and therefore they have impacts on their long-term career trajectory. So just to mention, these are things that can be measured, but indeed are more challenging. If we could just pass the mic.
Yeah. Okay. What are we doing? What's Google.org doing in order to, like, GiveWell is doing great work. We've got much more data and many, many more people.
Yeah.
Maybe we can do something a little bit better, take it to the next level. Yeah,
that's an excellent question. So I'll start with answering about Google.org, but then maybe say a few words about Google in general. Google.org mainly provides funding rather than the research themselves. They have at times had an amazing track record of being able to fund really important things. For example, Give Directly that I just mentioned. Google.org was a huge funder for them when they were incredibly small, which makes me very, very proud of Google.org. But usually they don't do interventions that are far away from funding. Usually most of their work is funding related. I think there's a lot that Google, not only .org, but Google in general can do to try and help people, whether that's using direct interventions, whether that's providing information to others. There's a lot of cool examples of this. Recently there was just an article about the Environmental Insights Explorer, where Google provides environmental data about pollution and things like that to cities and governments. There's the Google Earth Engine, which is a platform for a lot of researchers doing a lot of relevant work. And we're actually in conversations with various charities, including GiveWell, including ID Insight, that tries to collect information about this. So I think we need to encourage Google.org to continue to provide important funds to effective charities. And I think that even within Google.com, I think there's a lot more that we could do than we are doing right now. And I will say that at least from my experience, high up executives, if we're talking here about Yossi, if we're talking about Jeff Dean, and even Sundar himself, care deeply about these things. And when you have a really potentially impactful idea, they really do invest in these kinds of projects. So if you have ideas, and if you can back them up with evidence, I think Google is a really great place to try and push these forward.
Just to add to this, Google.org also finance technical projects with NGOs, and they actually fund the work of engineers and PMs for a 6-month period of fellowship. There was just an option open in EMEA a few months ago, and I know the PM that could join that. And they actually do technical projects within an NGO voluntarily.
Yeah, that's a good point.
My question was, these organizations also allow you to search within the organization that they recommend by subject? Like, let's say I'm more interested in education, in kids' health, and so forth, because otherwise everybody will probably give money to the first one and then...
Yeah, so it depends. So I think the Open Philanthropy Project has the largest range of different fields that they support, and there you can definitely look into the different fields and find whatever interests you in that. GiveWell have, within the scope of trying to find cost-effective interventions that are backed by evidence that help humans. They put animals aside. They found that just global health and development just tends to be significantly more cost-effective than other fields. So all of the recommendations are within that field. But yeah, when there is a variety, then you can search for those.
Also, you can also mention JPAL. JPAL has resources on various.
That's a good point. That's a good point. So JPAL, the Jamil Abdul Poverty Action Lab, thank you, is a research organization that does a lot of the research that a lot of these recommendations rely on. And they research a much wider variety of things, including in developed countries, including in different types of interventions. And there you can, in their website, you can search for different types of interventions. But it's a bit less, it's more for researchers. It's a bit less like, okay, this is a charity you wanna donate to.
Kind of follow-up question to the what could Google.com do? Yeah. So it's really great for all of us Googlers that you're here giving this very entertaining talk for the last hour. And I also know that Effective Altruism, there are TED Talks about that, and more people who want to know about that know about the whole scene, but still that's a very small percentage of population. Yeah. Do you know if there were ever any thoughts of making some of these research findings from these third parties easier accessible in Google.com search results? If yes, what's the state of that? If no, why not?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't know of any efforts to do that. I think there's doing anything to make certain types of results more accessible in Google.com is sometimes a touchy subject at Google. Google doesn't like to reprioritize different things. But I think that touches on the core of the issue, which is, there already exists. There exists, for example, GuideStar is the most famous charity navigator, so the website that most people go to when they're trying to look for donations. And GuideStar, I think, is a good example of just companies will end up serving what people are interested in, what they look for. And I think that if people don't understand why cost effectiveness is important, it'll be hard for that to be a critical factor in their decision. So that's why at least I personally believe in educating people about at least understanding something about why this is so important, which of course Google can be a part of doing that. But just to mention, I think it really, the donors have to want to optimize for cost effectiveness for there to be real change. That's at least my opinion. Awesome. So thank you all for your questions and your time, and go forth and prosper.